Hello, I'm Dr. Dan Ratner, and with me, as always, is Kasey Scheinvold, also known as Vlad to the Bone, and Ross the Boss.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ross the Boss, and I'm excited to talk baseball with you, cowboy.
All right, now, if you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below, and we'll get back to you personally. Now, guys, today we're going to talk about the waiver wire, and we're just talking strategy. How do you use this thing? Now, of course, we know the basics of it, but the waiver wire is really the most important tool for getting better during the year. Sure, you can rely on trades, but that depends on other people, all kinds of variables. The waiver wire is very straightforward. Guys, how do you use the waiver wire to improve during the year?
Well, obviously, I think the most important thing is to understand the rules of the waiver wire for your league. Obviously, there's some waiver wires where it's just at a certain time every night or every morning. People who've made claims for players, it goes through your waiver order, whether you're the first to pick that week or not, or that night. You get the player. Others have a waiver wire budget or a free agent acquisition budget, I think is what the actual acronym is, FAAB. And understanding how that works within your league is very important and determines the best ways to use your waiver wire.
Yeah, I mean, it really is going to depend on the league. You've got to know. Another thing you have to know is you got to know the players in your league. So, in our keeper league, for example, people go crazy for closers all the time. And I think people go crazy for closers all the time anyway. You have to know how much people are going to pay. So if somebody gets a save and they're taking over the closer spot, supposedly, you have to decide how much value are you going to put on that. You got to look at the prospects that are coming up, because those are other big time additions that happen on the waiver wire that you might need to pay big if you're not ahead of the curve. So I sometimes look at the waiver wire not just as who are you going to spend on, but also when are you going to spend on them? You want to try to get ahead of the curve. So that's another tip that I have for waiver wire. Ross, what would you say?
I think a good tip is, I'll give Yahoo an example because it's the most popular fantasy baseball site right now. So Yahoo has a thing where you can go on the waiver wire page. You can go to 2 weeks totals and see how many RBIs, runs, home runs, batting average. You can get all the averages for the past 2 weeks. And that's my thing. My thing's like the past 2 weeks. And then you could pick a player up. Let's say that's a streaker. I call him a streaker. I know he's a streamer. I call him a streaker because he's on fire right now. And, if you watch our waiver wire show, which I hope you do, we give you those names, but it's really important that you pick up these players that are streaking, because that's when you want to get them, because they're not going to last forever. We talk about this all the time. So you want to pick these streakers up on the waiver wire, obviously, and you'll probably dump them in a couple of weeks when they come back down to earth. So, and also with starting pitchers too. I mean, you look at probable pitchers, and if there's somebody that's kind of hot right now that's starting tomorrow, and you can pick them up for tomorrow's start, you might want to do that. But remember, you're limited to maybe usually between 6 or 7 pickups a week. Is that about right?
In head-to-head leagues.
In head-to-head, yeah. But you got to pay attention to how many waiver wire pickups you're allowed in the week or in the whole season, because there are regulations, and you got to be, sometimes you have a little strategy on that too. But, just be aware who's streaking and who's starting pitching the next day.
Yeah, I think those are good points. Certainly, when you're looking kind of short term on how to give yourself a boost for a given week or for a short period of time. When you're talking about a season-long league and having a waiver wire budget, we haven't talked much about a budget, but in a lot of leagues, you're given, let's say, $100 for the year to spend on free agent players, and you have to guess how much it's going to cost to get the hot shot player, the best player on the waiver wire, whatever it may be. One strategy I like to use is maximizing the value of my waiver wire budget. And that means spending a majority of it in the first few months of the season, because if I'm going to get the player that's the most expensive, I want to have him for as long as possible. Like for me, getting a closer who's really doing well in August or September, where he might only get you 5 saves, saving my waiver wire money to get him then doesn't provide me the same value as getting the player in April, in May, in the beginning of June, who's going to give me 3, 4 or more months of production to help my team in the long run. So a strategy I like to use is spending that money early on the players who I think are going to give me the most value throughout the season.
I also think that, you have to evaluate the waiver wire based on which players are the rare commodity. If there's a ton of guys out there who are really kind of interchangeable, that's not the time to pay for somebody. You can get it many, many times. So I think you want to look at, well, is this hot prospect rare? For instance, do they steal lots of bases and hit for power? That's different than a prospect who just steals bases. Now, stolen bases are becoming increasingly more rare over the many recent years, but you want to look for the guy that's the rarity. That includes, let's say, in a given year, a certain position is really thin. And suddenly you see, well, this guy is showing signs of a breakout. We got to look at the stats, the underlying stats. You could have a high prospect like a post-type sleeper who just had a bad year in his first year, but has a really good track record in the minors and is starting to show signs. You might need to pounce on him probably then. Usually you got to pounce on most of these guys because everybody's getting scooped up. There's a lot of turnover on the waiver wire because people are trying to find the gems. And I like your point, Kasey, about paying early because you get more of the value. But I think it's really important to look at, well, how hard is it to replace this kind of player?
Yeah, and that's right. And I like what you're talking about with regards to statistical rarity, and get the guys who contribute most in the statistics in the categories where it's rare to find that combination. But I think another thing to add to that is position scarcity. So if second base is very deep, hypothetically speaking, and I think you referenced this, spending a lot of money on a second baseman might not be as prudent as third base if third base is really thin and shallow, and suddenly, or you're weak at third base on your roster, and suddenly you find a third baseman on the waiver wire who is producing in a multitude of categories. Then it becomes more important, and that player becomes all the more valuable. It becomes more important to spend more money to get that player.
And remember, there's one thing with the waiver wire that you got to pay attention to. There's always that one dumb manager that will drop somebody because they're not playing up to their potential. And that player will be somebody that's really good, and he's just going through a tough time. He'll pop out of it. So you want to scoop in there and get that guy. You can stack him somewhere. You don't have to start him so quick. But there's always those one or two bonehead moves that happen every year that we talk about over dinner that people make because they just don't have the patience to wait for that certain player. So just go on the waiver wire, see what's happening, but try to just do it in the morning before you go to work or before you have your coffee or when you have your coffee, doesn't matter. But just pay attention what's going on, because you can get that one player that some idiot drops that's going to really make your season.
That brings me to another point, which is it's not just about who you're picking up. It's also who are you cutting.
Yeah.
Every time I make a pickup, I've got to evaluate my roster to see who's the guy who makes space for this. So to do that, you got to go ahead and look and see who am I going to cut. Now, who do I tend to like to cut?
Mike Trout.
Yeah. Not Mike Trout. No, the most replaceable guy. So that could mean the deepest position on the waiver wire, or it could mean the deepest position on my team.
Yep.
Or it could be, okay, this guy is, a serviceable veteran, but he doesn't have a lot of upside. You want to pick something that's lower risk. So this fits in with what you're saying, Ross. Sometimes people just cut a player because they've been burned by him and they're tired of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it happen a lot of times, especially when a pitcher gets completely blown up and they're just like, I want this guy off my team now.
Yeah. And you got to be aware, like when a catcher comes back off the DL, I mean, people are dropping catchers because they want to start that catcher now that's on the DL. And it happens all the time. I mean, there's players hit the DL, but as soon as a person comes off the DL, they got to cut somebody, like you just said. And sometimes they choose the wrong player to cut. So you got to be there to scoop them up.
Well, and you bring up a good point, Ross. And Dan, I know you're a big fan of this strategy, the same as I am. Understand how many IL spots you have on your roster. And if you have a vacant one, look at the waiver wire, go through it, and see if there's somebody who's on the IL currently who may be coming off that can provide value once they're healthy. And you can pick them up without dropping anybody, and they go directly into your IL spot. It's a way to almost like stash a player on your roster, and using the waiver wire that way can be really beneficial to you, because A lot of managers don't think that way. They don't think about, okay, who can I pick up before they're performing or before they come off injury and keep them pretty much risk-free? Because if they then get healthy and stink, or because of the injury have lingering performance problems, you can just drop them. But it's another way to use the waiver wire to get a little bit of an advantage over your competition by picking them up while they're still hurt, assuming you have the IL spot available on your roster.
Similar to that, if you've got a guy who's just day-to-day and injured but might go on the IL, you might want to wait until he does. Switch him out with somebody on the IL that you have stashed that isn't that valuable. Then you got somebody you can cut that's totally replaceable. So in the end, you're really looking for what's the best value, how are we going to place that value, especially if you have free agent budget, and then who are you going to cut? And really, it's all about maximizing every single roster space. Guys, what else would you add about waiver wire that these guys need to know?
I mean, as I said on top of the show, I said you got to pay attention. You can't blow it off like it's not there. You've got to go on the waiver wire and just see who's available, who's not available, who just been cut. And also, like Kasey talks about this all the time on the waiver wire show. I mean, you got to look at future guys that are coming up out of the minors that people are really high on, and you can stash those guys also. And that's another big point of waiver wire is getting those youngsters that have not hit the majors yet but are about to. And you got to be aware what's going on. You got to read about it. You know, there's a lot of great publications that you can read, or you can just watch a waiver wire show and can tell you instead of you read. You can just watch. It's easier. But all you know, just being educated. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I alluded to it earlier, but don't be cheap with your free agent budget. If you really believe in a guy and you look at the underlying statistics and you look at how he's performing and you think he can help your team for a long time, don't get cheap on your bid. I would rather overpay and pay $20 or 20% more of my free agent budget than the next guy bidding for him to ensure I get him, then get outbid by $1 or $2 because I was afraid to use too much of my budget. You will more regret the players that you don't get than you will the players that you overspent to get, because most of them are replaceable, but overspend if you really believe in the guy because he can be the difference maker for the entire season for you.
Or the entire, or 10 years if it's a keeper league, who knows?
Correct.
Well, let me just add one thing, and that goes along with what Ross is saying. If you did put in a big claim for somebody, give them a chance. You know, a lot of times people, they put in a big bid and then they're terrible for a week and they cut them. Well, then you really just wasted the money. You know, you really want to think about, it's okay to overpay. I think it's a great idea, as long as you know that you're going in for the long haul. So try to target guys that you really, really think you're more confident about. Don't just take a chance on somebody. Be willing to let guys go. That's something that sometimes people struggle with. They think I got to get the every single hottest guy. But the reality is you have to be willing to let some players go when you just don't feel the value's there. All right, guys, I think we did a good job getting people up to speed on how to use the waiver wire. Lots of strategies to think about. But we've given people a good chance, and when we're talking sophisticated players, by the way, who they know, you guys know how to use the wire, but to think about these strategies and how to decide which one to use when, it takes some real thought. This is where it really matters just how much you've studied the game. Thank you so much for watching. Keep up with us on MFSN on YouTube. If you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below, and we'll get back to you personally.